The October wind carried the scent of rain and rotting leaves as the diligence coach lurched to a stop before the monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial. Our man, Diego Mendoza, pressed his face against the window, and there it was. Philip II's great stone poem to God and empire, rising from the Castilian plain like a mountain carved by giants. 42 years of life had taught him to distrust first impressions. But this was different. The building didn't merely occupy space, it commanded it, demanded submission from the very air around it. Magnificent and terrible, he murmured to himself, then chuckled. His late wife would have added, like most things men build to impress God. 3 years since tuberculosis took her, and still he heard her voice at the oddest moments. The driver shouted something about 15 minutes for the horses, and Diego climbed down, his legs protesting after 8 hours of bone-rattling travel from Madrid. His trunk followed, thudding onto the cobblestones with the weight of the tools of his trade. Magnifying glasses, chemical reagents, binding materials, and enough ink to catalog an empire, which, in a sense, was exactly what Don Carlos de Montemayor had hired him to do. 40,000 volumes and manuscripts, the nobleman had said, accumulated over 3 centuries and desperately needing modern cataloging. 6 months' work, perhaps more. Good money for a widowed archivist with no one waiting at home. Brother Tomas appeared at the monastery gate like a shadow taking form, black robes flapping in the wind. 58 years old, according to Diego's correspondence, though he looked older, that particular kind of aging that comes from too many years bent over manuscripts in poor light. But it was the hands Diego noticed first. They trembled slightly as the monk extended them in greeting, a tremor quickly suppressed by clasping them together. "Señor Mendoza, welcome. We've been expecting you." The brother's breath carried a faint sweetness that made Diego think of communion wine, though surely it was too early in the day for Mass. They walked through courtyards where October had turned the gardens brown and gold, past fountains that whispered rather than sang. The monastery was a city unto itself, church, palace, library, mausoleum. Brother Tomas provided commentary in the practiced manner of someone who'd given this tour many times, yet Diego detected genuine pride when they reached the library doors. "Here we are," the monk announced, producing an iron key that looked old enough to have opened doors for Philip himself. "Your kingdom for the next several months." Kingdom indeed. The main hall stretched before them, 2 stories high, with ladders reaching toward a ceiling painted with allegories Diego couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Books lined every wall, their leather spines like scales on some ancient dragon. The smell hit him immediately. Paper and leather, yes, but underneath, something else. Time itself, perhaps. Or secrets. In his experience, old libraries always smelled of secrets. 40,000 volumes, Brother Tomas said, and that tremor was back in his hands. "Though if I'm honest, we stopped counting years ago. Some sections haven't been properly examined since the French were here in 1808. Diego ran his finger along a shelf, collecting dust that felt archaeological. His mind was already categorizing, organizing, planning his approach. Start with the incunabula, perhaps, or the manuscript collection. But Brother Tomas was still talking. "Your quarters are in the north wing, near the novices. Simple, but comfortable enough. You'll take meals with us. Lauds at 5:30 if you're inclined to join us, though Don Carlos made it clear you're under no religious obligations." A pause, then quieter. he also mentioned you're a widower." "My condolences." Strange how that word still stung. Widower. As if losing Maria had transformed him into a new category of person. Diego merely nodded, and Brother Tomas seemed to understand that some wounds were best left unprobed. That first evening, sitting at the long refectory table while a young monk read from the lives of the saints, Diego studied his new world. The monastery housed perhaps 30 brothers, ranging from ancient men who seemed held together by habit alone to young novices who fidgeted through the readings. One caught his attention, a boy of perhaps 19 with intelligent eyes and ink-stained fingers. The boy noticed Diego watching and quickly looked away, but not before Diego caught something in his expression. Doubt? Fear? Or simply the nervousness of youth? The food was simple but good. White bean stew, coarse bread, watered wine. The monks ate in prescribed silence while the reader droned on about St. Teresa's ecstasies. Diego found himself thinking about taxonomy, about the difference between organizing books and organizing lives. Both required systems, categories, rules. But books, at least, stayed where you put them. After Compline, Brother Tomas showed him to his cell. They called it a cell, though it was larger than his apartment in Madrid. A bed, a desk, a crucifix, a window overlooking the Guadarrama Mountains. Everything he needed, and nothing he didn't. "I should mention," Brother Tomas said, hovering in the doorway, "there are certain volumes we keep locked away, restricted works. The Inquisition may be officially gone, but some books," he shrugged. "Well, you'll see. Everything in time." Alone at last, Diego unpacked his tools, arranging them on the desk with the precision of a surgeon preparing for operation. Outside, wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the monastery, bells marked another hour's passing. He thought about Madrid, about the empty apartment he'd left behind, about Isabel Vargas, the widow who ran the inn where he'd stopped for lunch and who'd mentioned she supplied provisions to the monastery weekly. Tomorrow he would begin his real work, transforming chaos into order, mystery into knowledge. But tonight, listening to the wind and the distant sound of chanting, Diego Mendoza allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the past, preparing to make it speak. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was moonlight on the mountains, and the last thing he wondered was why Brother Tomas's hands shook when he held that ancient key. 7 days into his cataloging, Diego had established a rhythm as regular as the monastery bells. Rise before dawn, work through the morning while the light was best, break for the midday meal, then continue until vespers. He'd already processed 300 volumes, each one noted in his ledger with the precision of a banker counting gold. The work was meditative, almost peaceful, until Brother Tomas arrived that October morning with a ring of keys that sang like wind chimes. "There's something you should see," the monk said, and Diego noticed the tremor in his hands was worse today, though the morning was mild. "Don Carlos insisted you catalog everything, even the restricted materials." They walked past the main stacks to a corner Diego hadn't yet explored, where an iron gate blocked access to a narrow alcove. The lock protested as Brother Tomas turned the key, metal grinding against metal in a way that set teeth on edge. Inside, perhaps 50 volumes sat behind glass, along with a collection of scrolls and loose parchments in protective folders. Most of these are simply heretical, Brother Tomas explained, gesturing at volumes Diego recognized. Galileo's Dialogue, several works by Erasmus that had fallen from favor, a Hebrew text that might have been Kabbalistic. But this... He stopped before a locked cabinet within the already locked room, a redundancy that spoke of special concern. "This is why I brought you here today." The cabinet held a single parchment, laid flat under glass like a specimen in a naturalist's collection. At first glance, nothing remarkable. Medieval work, probably 13th century from the script style, written in Latin. Diego bent closer, adjusting his spectacles. "The phantom parchment," Brother Tomas whispered, as if the document might hear. "Every monk here knows the story. During storms, when the air grows heavy with moisture, blood-red letters appear between the lines. Warnings, curses. Some say it's the blood of the heretic who wrote it, seeping through time itself." Diego suppressed a smile. In 20 years of archival work, he'd heard similar stories about a dozen different documents. Usually, they turned out to be nothing more than water damage or foxing that imaginative minds transformed into messages from beyond. Still, he'd learned not to dismiss local legends too quickly. Sometimes they preserved real information wrapped in supernatural cloth. "When did someone last observe this phenomenon?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Last winter. Young Brother Miguel swore he saw words forming during a December storm. But then, Brother Miguel also claims to have visions during his fasts, so..." Tomas shrugged. Diego made notes in his ledger, then carefully removed the glass cover. The parchment felt normal, slightly stiff with age, but well preserved. The visible text appeared to be a mundane legal document about water rights. He was about to replace the glass when he noticed something. The faintest discoloration between the lines. Patterns that didn't match the main text's ink flow. Outside, clouds had been gathering all morning, and now the first drops of rain struck the windows. The sound echoed in the restricted vault like fingertips drumming on a table. Diego watched the parchment and... there. Was that his imagination, or did those pale marks seem slightly darker? "Fetch me some cloths and a basin of water," he told Brother Tomas, who looked scandalized at the suggestion. "I need to test something." While the monk was gone, Diego examined the document more carefully. The main text was definitely medieval, but those faint patterns, they seemed more recent. The ink formulation was different, he'd swear to it. When Brother Tomas returned, Diego dampened a cloth and held it near, not touching, the parchment. The humidity in the air increased, and like a photograph developing in chemical solution, pink letters began to emerge between the lines. Brother Tomas crossed himself. "Santa Maria, it's happening." But Diego was leaning closer, fascinated. The emerging text wasn't Latin. It was Spanish, and modern Spanish at that. Not medieval or even Renaissance, but something from perhaps 50 or 60 years ago. The letters weren't blood red, but rose pink, and as he watched them darken, a memory stirred. His chemistry professor at the University of Madrid demonstrating sympathetic inks. "Cobalt chloride," he said aloud, then louder when Brother Tomas gasped. "It's not blood, brother. It's chemistry. Cobalt salts are invisible when dry, but absorb moisture from the air and turn pink. A spy's trick, not a devil's curse." The emerging text was becoming clearer. Numbers, dates, what looked like troop positions. Diego's pulse quickened. This wasn't medieval at all. This was from the Peninsular War, Napoleon's invasion. Someone had used an old parchment as cover, writing intelligence between the lines of a boring legal document. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and rain lashed the windows with sudden violence. The pink letters grew darker, more defined. Diego read quickly, his practiced eye parsing the abbreviated Spanish. French regiment moving through valley, 2,000 men, cavalry screen heading north. Signed, El Cuervo. The Raven. A code name, obviously. Someone in the monastery had been passing intelligence during the war, using chemistry that would have seemed like magic to most observers. Brilliant, really. Who would suspect a cursed parchment that everyone was afraid to handle? "This changes things," Brother Tomas said, and Diego was surprised to hear excitement rather than fear in his voice. "If it's not supernatural, if it's historical, Father Superior will want to know immediately." They spent the next hour documenting everything as the storm raged outside. Diego made detailed notes about the chemical process, the text's content, the probable date of the hidden writing. Brother Tomas, seemingly energized by the discovery, fetched additional documents from the restricted collection. If one has hidden text, he reasoned, perhaps others do as well. By evening, they'd found 3 more parchments with similar properties. All contained military intelligence from the period of 1808 to 1814. All were signed El Cuervo, and all had been hidden in plain sight for 50 years, their secret protected by superstition and fear. After Vespers, Diego walked through the rain to the small inn just outside the monastery walls. He needed supplies from town, more chemical reagents, better magnifying equipment. The inn was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cooking onions. Isabel Vargas, the widow who ran it, looked up from her account books as he entered. "Señor Mendoza, you're soaked through. Come, sit by the fire." She was perhaps 31, with the kind of practical beauty that comes from competence rather than ornament. Her husband had died 2 years ago, thrown from a horse, according to monastery gossip, leaving her with the inn and considerable debt. She'd managed both with apparent skill. "Working late at the monastery, I see," she said, bringing him hot wine without being asked. "Brother Tomas says you're cataloging the entire library." "It's proving more interesting than expected," Diego admitted, warming his hands on the cup. "Tell me, Señora Vargas, do you know any stories about the monastery during the French War?" Her expression sharpened. "My grandmother lived through it. She said the monks hid guerrilleros in the crypts, tended wounded patriots." "Some say they did more than that one of them ran a spy network right under French noses." She paused, studying him. "But surely those are just stories." Diego thought about pink letters blooming like flowers in the rain. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps the past is more present than we think." Walking back to the monastery, rain still falling but softer now, Diego reflected on the day's discoveries. Tomorrow he would need to examine the documents more systematically, perhaps identify El Cuervo through handwriting analysis or historical records. But tonight, he felt the satisfaction of mystery partially unveiled, of history speaking through chemistry and chance. November arrived with frost on the monastery windows, and Diego's investigation into the sympathetic inks had become systematic, almost obsessive. He'd transformed a corner of the library into a makeshift laboratory. Bottles of chemical solutions lined up like soldiers, different papers for testing, cloths of varying dampness to control humidity. The monks watched his activities with a mixture of curiosity and concern, as if he were practicing alchemy rather than chemistry. The young novice Mateo proved unexpectedly helpful. Diego had noticed him lingering near the workspace, ink-stained fingers betraying his role as one of the monastery's copyists. The boy had intelligent eyes that reminded Diego of himself at that age, eager but cautious, faithful but questioning. "You're interested in the science?" Diego asked one morning, catching Mateo examining his reagents. "Brother Tomas says you've proven the phantom parchment isn't cursed," the boy replied, then added quietly, "I always suspected." God doesn't need cheap tricks to manifest his power. It was a surprisingly sophisticated theological position for a 19-year-old novice. Diego filed the observation away and set the boy to work preparing test solutions. Together, they'd identified 17 documents with hidden text, all from the same period, all bearing El Cuervo's signature. The process was delicate. Too much moisture and the revealed text would blur. Too little and it remained invisible. Diego had developed a technique using controlled exposure to steam from heated water, allowing the pink letters to emerge gradually while he transcribed them. Each document told a piece of a larger story. French troop movements, supply routes, the names of collaborators and patriots. It was like assembling a puzzle where half the pieces had been invisible. On the 3rd of November, All Souls' Day having just passed, Diego made a disturbing discovery. He'd been working late, the library empty except for shadows cast by his oil lamp, when footsteps echoed in the hall. He expected Mateo, or perhaps Brother Tomas, but instead found the monk slumped against the doorframe, clearly drunk. "Señor Mendoza," Tomas slurred, attempting dignity and failing. "Still working, I see." The smell of wine was overwhelming. Not communion wine, but something stronger, probably from the medicinal stores. Diego moved quickly, supporting the monk before he could fall. "Perhaps you should rest, brother." "Rest?" Tomas laughed bitterly. 58 years old, and I've never rested. Do you know what it's like, Señor? To spend your life preserving words you're forbidden to read, to guard treasures you can't touch. His hands shook violently now, and Diego realized the tremor wasn't age, but withdrawal, temporarily quieted by alcohol. Diego guided him to a chair, his mind racing. If Father Superior discovered Brother Tomas drunk in the library, the consequences would be severe. Reassignment, certainly, possibly excommunication. The man had been kind to him, helpful despite his struggles. "When did this start?" Diego asked gently. "Years ago, after my brother died in the Carlist Wars. He was the soldier, I was the scholar. He got glory, I got..." He gestured vaguely at the books. "Dust and silence." Diego made a decision that surprised him. He helped Brother Tomas to his own quarters, not the monk's cell. Let him sleep it off here, away from prying eyes. In the morning, they could speak more frankly. As he settled the monk onto his narrow bed, Tomas grabbed his arm. "The documents you're finding," he whispered urgently. "Be careful. Some secrets are better left buried." While Brother Tomas slept, Diego returned to the library, unable to rest. He pulled the monastery records from 1808 to 1814, searching for any mention of El Cuervo. The official chronicles were predictably bland. Prayers said, masses held, occasional mentions of difficulties during the French occupation. But in the pharmacy records he found something interesting. Unusual quantities of cobalt salts had been ordered during those years, ostensibly for treating certain ailments, but the amounts were far too large for medicinal use. Someone had been manufacturing sympathetic ink on a significant scale. The records were signed by Brother Francisco, the monastery's chief copyist at the time. Dawn was breaking when Mateo found him still reading, surrounded by ledgers and chemical equipment. "You didn't sleep?" the novice observed. "Sometimes the past won't let you," Diego replied. Then, studying the young man's troubled expression, "Is something wrong?" Mateo hesitated, clearly wrestling with a decision. Finally, "I need to tell someone. I don't think I have a vocation. The monastic life, it's not—" He stopped, afraid. Diego set down his magnifying glass. Here was another secret, another hidden text waiting to be revealed. "How long have you felt this way?" "Months, maybe longer. My family sent me here when I was 14. They said God had chosen me, but I think they just had too many mouths to feed." The words came faster now, like water through a broken dam. "I want to study, yes, but at the university, natural philosophy, chemistry like you're doing. Is that evil? To want something other than what's been chosen for you?" "No," Diego said firmly. "It's human." They were interrupted by Brother Tomas, who appeared looking haggard but sober. He avoided Diego's eyes, mumbling thanks for assistance with his illness the previous night. But as the day progressed, Diego noticed the monk staying closer, helping with the chemical work as if seeking redemption through usefulness. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Colonel Herrera, recently retired from the military, had come to research his family's history in the monastery archives. He was 55, steel-gray hair and bearing still military straight, with eyes that missed nothing. "I hear you've made interesting discoveries," he said, watching Diego work with the sympathetic inks. "Historical curiosities," Diego replied carefully. Something about the colonel's intensity set him on edge. "From the Peninsular War period, I understand. My grandfather served then. Here, actually, with the guerrilleros. Perhaps your documents mention him. Miguel Herrera?" Diego kept his expression neutral, but he remembered that name from one of El Cuervo's reports. Miguel Herrera had been listed as a suspected collaborator with the French, though the evidence had been circumstantial. "I'll check my notes," he said diplomatically. The colonel lingered, examining Diego's chemical apparatus with obvious interest. Remarkable, using science to reveal the past. Like archaeology, but for secrets rather than pottery shards. After he left, Brother Tomas whispered urgently, "Be very careful with that one. His family has been trying to clear their name for 50 years. They say his grandfather was executed for treason, though some claim he was innocent." That evening, Diego walked to Isabel's inn for supper, needing distance from the monastery's increasingly oppressive atmosphere. She served him rabbit stew and good bread, sitting across from him as the common room emptied. "You look troubled," she observed. "Secrets have weight," he replied. "The more you uncover, the heavier they become." My late husband used to say something similar. He was a notary, dealt with wills and inheritances. Said every family had shadows they paid him to keep dark. She refilled his wine cup. "But you're not a keeper of secrets, are you?" "You're a revealer." "Is that better or worse?" she smiled. And for the first time he noticed the way lamplight caught gold flecks in her brown eyes. "That depends on whether the truth serves the living or only disturbs the dead." Walking back to the monastery under stars sharp as glass in the cold November air, Diego pondered her words. In his quarters he found a note slipped under the door. Anonymous, but the handwriting looked familiar. "Some ravens are better left unidentified, for all our sakes." He burned the note in his candle flame, watching the paper curl and blacken. Tomorrow he would continue his investigation. The truth, whatever it was, demanded revelation. But tonight he double-checked his door lock and wondered if his trust in those around him was perhaps too generous for the secrets he was uncovering.
The 18th of November brought unseasonable warmth to the mountains, a false spring that made the monastery stones sweat and filled Diego's makeshift laboratory with perfect humidity for revealing hidden texts. He'd been working since before matins, transcribing the latest discoveries, when the pattern finally crystallized in his mind like frost forming on glass. 23 documents now, all connected. Not random intelligence reports, but a coordinated network, each parchment referencing others in a complex web of information. El Cuervo hadn't worked alone. There were mentions of the baker's widow, the shepherd of Guadarrama, the silent confessor. Code names, obviously, but they painted a picture of an intelligence operation far more sophisticated than Diego had initially imagined. Mateo worked beside him, having become indispensable over the past weeks. The boy had a talent for chemistry and an even greater gift for discretion. He'd taken to preparing the chemical solutions each morning, measuring cobalt chloride and iron sulfate with the precision of a pharmacist. "Look at this," Mateo said, pointing to a passage he'd just revealed. "These aren't just troop movements. They're supply line vulnerabilities, weather predictions, even the personal habits of French officers." Diego examined the text. The boy was right. One report detailed how a particular French colonel always visited his mistress on Tuesday evenings, leaving his garrison understaffed. Another noted that supply wagons from Madrid always took the same route, perfect for ambush. This wasn't battlefield intelligence. It was intimate knowledge that could only come from someone with access to the French command structure. "El Cuervo was inside," Diego murmured. "Not just observing, but participating. Hidden in plain sight." The revelation coincided with Brother Tomas arriving, notably steady-handed this morning. He'd been sober for 2 weeks now, throwing himself into helping Diego's research with the fervor of a penitent. "Father Superior wishes to speak with you," he announced. "And Don Carlos has arrived from Madrid." The monastery's great hall felt colder than the library, despite a fire crackling in the massive hearth. Father Superior Joaquin sat behind an oak table that had probably served abbots for centuries, his 71 years showing in the deep lines around his eyes. Don Carlos de Montemayor stood by the window, impeccably dressed as always, his 65 years carried with the confidence of wealth. "Señor Mendoza," Don Carlos began without preamble, "I'm hearing remarkable things about your discoveries. Hidden texts, wartime intelligence. This isn't quite the simple cataloging job I hired you for." "Cataloging reveals what exists," Diego replied carefully. "I'm simply being thorough." Father Superior leaned forward. "These documents you're finding, they could be sensitive. The war may be 50 years past, but families still bear the scars. Reputations destroyed, fortunes lost, blood feuds that simmer even now." "Which is precisely why they should be properly documented," Don Carlos countered. "History demands truth, not comfortable lies." Diego sensed an old argument between the two men.
philosophical positions worn smooth by repetition. He cleared his throat. Perhaps the question isn't whether to document them, but how. A sealed archive, accessible only to serious scholars? Both men turned to him and he continued. The chemical process alone is worth preserving. It's scientific history. As for the intelligence reports, they're military history. Both deserve preservation, but perhaps with discretion. Don Carlos smiled thinly. Discretion, a diplomat's word.
Very well, continue your work, but keep me informed of anything particularly significant. After the meeting, Diego returned to find Colonel Herrera in the library, examining his workstation with undisguised interest. Mateo stood nearby, clearly uncomfortable but too polite to ask the man to leave. "Ah, Señor Mendoza," the colonel said smoothly. "I hope you don't mind. Young brother Mateo was showing me your chemical process. Fascinating." "It's delicate work," Diego said, moving to block the colonel's view of his notes. "The wrong mixture can destroy the documents entirely." "Of course. I wouldn't dream of interfering." The colonel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I wonder, though, have you found any mention of my grandfather, Miguel Herrera? It's a matter of some importance to my family." Diego had, in fact, found several mentions. According to El Cuervo's reports, Miguel Herrera had been seen entering French headquarters multiple times, always at night. Another report suggested he'd provided information about guerrilla positions. But there was something odd about these accusations. They lacked the detail present in other intelligence, as if El Cuervo was reporting hearsay rather than direct observation. "I'll review my transcriptions," Diego said neutrally. The colonel left, but his presence lingered like smoke. That evening, Diego decided to visit Isabel's inn again, partly for supper, but mostly to clear his head. The walk through November dusk was pleasant, with wood smoke rising from chimneys and the sound of evening prayers drifting from the monastery. Isabel greeted him warmly, her smile genuine in a way that made him realize how many false smiles he'd seen lately. She served him lamb stew with winter vegetables, then surprised him by sitting down with her own bowl. "You don't mind if I join you? The evening crowd won't arrive for another hour." "Please," Diego said, grateful for uncomplicated company. They ate in comfortable silence before she spoke. "Colonel Herrera was here yesterday, asking about you. Wanted to know what kind of man you were, whether you could be trusted." "What did you tell him?" "That you seemed honest to a fault." He didn't look pleased. She paused, studying him. "He also asked if you could be bought." Diego nearly choked on his wine. "Bought?" "His words, not mine. I told him I doubted it, that you had the look of a man who serves truth rather than gold." She smiled wryly. He definitely didn't like that answer. They talked until the inn filled with locals, and Diego found himself lingering, helping her serve drinks and clear tables. It felt good to do simple, physical work after days of chemical mysteries and encoded secrets. When he finally left, she touched his arm lightly. "Be careful, Diego. The colonel isn't the only one interested in your discoveries." "I've heard whispers in the market. Old families worried about old sins coming to light." Walking back to the monastery under a crescent moon, Diego reflected on the web he'd stumbled into. Each revealed document pulled another thread, threatening to unravel secrets that had been safely buried for decades. Tomorrow he would need to examine the monastery's personnel records from the war years, try to identify El Cuervo through handwriting or circumstantial evidence. In his cell he found another note under the door,
Different handwriting this time. The French are gone, but their collaborators' descendants remain. Some stones are better left unturned. This one he kept, filing it with his growing collection of warnings. Someone was very concerned about his investigation, concerned enough to watch him, to threaten subtly. But Diego had spent 3 years learning that life was too short for comfortable lies.
Maria's death had taught him that truth, however painful, was better than illusion. He prepared his chemicals for tomorrow's work, grinding cobalt salts in his mortar, mixing solutions that would make the past speak. Outside, wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the monastery, someone was singing, a low, mournful song that might have been a lament or might have been a prayer. December 2nd arrived with snow on the Guadarrama peaks, and Diego stood in the monastery's archive room surrounded by 40 years of personnel records. Brother Tomas had provided the keys that morning with steady hands, 3 weeks sober now, and Mateo worked beside him, comparing handwriting samples with the meticulous patience of a true scholar. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the pharmacy ledgers. Brother Francisco, chief copyist during the French occupation, had signed for those unusual quantities of cobalt salts. But more telling was his secondary role. He'd served as assistant to the monastery's pharmacist, giving him both the knowledge and materials to create sympathetic inks. "Look at this," Mateo said, holding 2 documents side by side. One was Francisco's official correspondence about manuscript repairs. The other was one of El Cuervo's revealed intelligence reports. The letter formations are identical. See how he curves his S and crosses his T high and to the right? Diego examined them under his magnifying glass. The boy was right. Accounting for the difference between hurried secret writing and careful official script, the hands were unmistakably the same. Brother Francisco, mild copyist and assistant pharmacist, had been El Cuervo. But knowing who raised more questions than it answered. How had a cloistered monk gathered such detailed intelligence? Who were his contacts? And most puzzling, why had he accused Miguel Herrera of collaboration with such vague, uncharacteristic reports? The monastery records painted a picture of Francisco as unremarkable. Entered the monastery at 16, showed aptitude for letters and languages, assigned to the scriptorium at 20. During the war years, he'd been in his early 30s, young enough for dangerous work, but old enough for discretion. The records noted his death in December of 1814, just months after the French withdrawal, from a fever of the lungs. "Convenient," Diego muttered, making notes. How many resistance fighters had died of mysterious fevers once their usefulness ended? That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the library. Don Carlos had returned from Madrid, but this time accompanied by a younger man in expensive clothes who had the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal. "This is my nephew, Eduardo," Don Carlos explained. "He's studying at the university, writing a thesis on the Peninsular War. I thought your discoveries might interest him." Eduardo examined Diego's work with intelligent eyes, asking perceptive questions about the chemical process and the coding systems used in the messages. But when he saw the name Miguel Herrera in one of the transcriptions, his face paled. That's Colonel Herrera's grandfather," he said quietly. "You know the colonel?" Diego asked. "Everyone in certain circles knows him. He's been trying to rehabilitate his family name for years. Offers substantial donations to anyone who might help prove his grandfather's innocence." Eduardo paused meaningfully. Substantial. Don Carlos frowned at his nephew's implications but didn't contradict him.
After they left, Brother Tomas approached Diego with unusual urgency. "You should know something," he said quietly. "I've been reading the Monastery Chronicles more carefully. Brother Francisco didn't die of fever."
The entry was amended later. The ink is different, newer. The original cause of death was scraped away. Diego felt a chill that had nothing to do with December cold. A murdered spy, hidden intelligence, accusations of treason. He was uncovering something darker than wartime espionage. That evening, he found Colonel Herrera waiting at Isabel's inn, sitting at what had become Diego's usual table. The message was clear. "I know your routines, your refuges." "Señor Mendoza," the colonel said pleasantly, "I thought we might speak privately." Diego sat carefully, noting Isabel's worried glance from behind the bar. The colonel produced a leather pouch, heavy with coin, and placed it on the table between them. "I'm not trying to buy you," Herrera said. "I'm trying to buy time. Time to review your discoveries before they become public. Time to prepare my family for whatever truth emerges." "The truth is still emerging," Diego replied, not touching the purse. "Then let me add to it." The colonel leaned forward. "My grandfather was executed 3 days after the French left Madrid. No trial, just guerrillero justice. They said he'd collaborated, but the only evidence was rumors and those intelligence reports you are finding. He left behind a widow and 3 children who spent the next 50 years living with that shame." "I'm sorry for your family's pain. I don't want pity," Herrera interrupted. "I want truth. Was my grandfather a traitor or a scapegoat? Your chemicals might reveal what really happened." Diego chose his words carefully. "The reports mentioning your grandfather are different from the others. Less detailed, more speculative, as if El Cuervo was reporting what he'd heard rather than what he'd seen." Hope flickered in the colonel's eyes. "Then perhaps many things. I need more time to understand the full picture." The colonel stood, leaving the purse on the table. "For your time, then." "Not for any particular conclusion." After he left, Isabel approached with a cup of wine. "You refused his money," she observed. "I left it on the table. There's a difference." She sat where the colonel had been, her presence immediately warmer. "You're playing a dangerous game, Diego. Old wounds, old families with new power." "I'm not playing anything. I'm reading what's been hidden and trying to understand it." "The same thing, viewed from different angles." She touched his hand lightly. "Would you like some advice?" "Always." "Remember that the dead can't be hurt by truth. Only the living can. Choose your revelations wisely." Back at the monastery, Diego found Mateo waiting in the library with another discovery. Hidden in the binding of a psalter, he'd found a single sheet covered in sympathetic ink. But this wasn't intelligence. It was a confession. Under Diego's chemical treatment, Brother Francisco's words emerged in pink script. "I write this in the shadow of death, knowing they come for me tonight. The war is over, but its sins remain. I accused an innocent man to protect a guilty one. Miguel Herrera was no traitor. He met with the French to negotiate the release of Spanish prisoners, including my own brother. But the real collaborator, the one who sold guerrilla positions for gold, was Roberto Montemayor, cousin to the noble family. I couldn't expose him without destroying the monastery's greatest benefactors. May God forgive my cowardice. I die with this lie on my conscience." Diego stared at the revealed text,
understanding flooding through him like ice water. Don Carlos de Montemayor, his employer, patron of this entire cataloging project, his family built their current fortune on blood money. And Brother Francisco had died to keep that secret, after destroying an innocent man to protect it.
Mateo read over his shoulder, his young face grave with understanding. "What do we do with this?" It was past midnight, the monastery silent except for winter wind testing the windows. Diego thought about the colonel's hope, Don Carlos's patronage, the weight of truth versus the comfort of lies. He thought about Isabel's advice and Brother Francisco's confession. "We document everything," he said finally. "But first, we make copies, multiple copies. Truth this dangerous needs insurance." They worked until dawn, creating duplicates of the confession using both standard and sympathetic inks. One copy Diego hid in his personal effects. Another he had Mateo conceal in a location known only to the boy. The original he would need to handle very carefully indeed. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow pink as revealed secrets, Diego realized he'd crossed a line. He was no longer just an archivist cataloging old documents. He was now guardian of a truth that could destroy reputations, perhaps even lives. The question was, what did justice look like 50 years after the crime? The 14th of December brought bitter cold and an unexpected summons. Father Superior Joaquin wanted Diego in his study immediately, the messenger said, and his tone suggested this wasn't a request. Diego found the elderly priest standing by his window, watching snow fall on the monastery courtyard, while Don Carlos sat in a leather chair, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Sit," Father Superior commanded, his 71 years carrying the authority of someone who'd outlived most challenges. "Don Carlos tells me you've made disturbing discoveries." Diego kept his expression neutral, wondering what exactly his patron knew. "Historical documents often contain disturbing elements, Father." "Don't play word games with me, my son. Brother Tomas, in his enthusiasm to help your research, mentioned you've identified El Cuervo." The priest turned from the window, his eyes sharp as winter frost. "This troubles me deeply." Don Carlos shifted in his chair. "What troubles me is the pace of your work, Mendoza. You were hired to catalog, not to conduct historical investigations. Perhaps we should limit your access to the restricted materials." It was a threat, politely delivered but unmistakable. Diego thought of Francisco's confession hidden in his room, the truth about Roberto Montemayor's treachery. Did they know? Or was this general nervousness about old secrets? The catalog would be incomplete without the restricted works, Diego said carefully. And the sympathetic ink documents are historically significant. The chemical process alone can be documented without revealing the specific content, Don Carlos interrupted. "I'm thinking of the monastery's reputation, you understand." Father Superior returned to his desk, fingers steepled in contemplation. "Brother Francisco was a good man who served God and Spain. Whatever activities he engaged in during the war, they were exceptional circumstances. I won't have his memory sullied." "I have no intention of sullying anyone's memory," Diego replied, choosing each word like a step across thin ice. "My job is to preserve and catalog, nothing more."
After the meeting, Diego found Brother Tomas waiting in the hallway, wringing his hands, not from drink this time, but anxiety. "I'm sorry," he whispered urgently. "Father Superior pressed me about your work. I mentioned Francisco, but nothing about the other matters." "It's all right," Diego assured him, though his mind was racing. How much time did he have before they discovered what he'd really found? That afternoon, Colonel Herrera appeared in the library like a ghost materializing from shadow.
Diego hadn't heard him approach. Suddenly, the man was just there, examining the chemical equipment with casual interest. "You've been avoiding me," the colonel said without preamble. "I've been working. Yes, I heard. Don Carlos is nervous. When powerful men get nervous, they make rash decisions." Herrera picked up a vial of cobalt solution, holding it to the light. "I also heard you've identified El Cuervo as Brother Francisco." News traveled fast in the monastery's closed world. Diego said nothing, continuing to transcribe a recently revealed document. "My sources tell me," Herrera continued, "that you found something significant, something that might clear my grandfather's name." Diego looked up sharply. Sources? Who had been talking? Not Mateo, surely. The boy understood the danger. But there were many eyes in a monastery, many ears in stone walls. "Your sources are premature," Diego said. "The investigation isn't complete. Investigations can be completed by others if necessary." The threat was subtle but clear. "I've waited 55 years for truth, Mendoza. I can be patient, but not indefinitely." After the colonel left, Diego made a decision. He needed to secure the evidence before someone decided to secure him. He found Mateo in the scriptorium, practicing his letters with the dedication of someone planning a different future. "I need you to take something to Madrid," Diego said quietly. "Tonight." The boy's eyes widened. "But I'm not permitted to leave." "You're not leaving. You're running an errand for the catalog project. Take this to the university, to Professor Martinez in the chemistry department." Diego handed him a sealed package, copies of Francisco's confession in both regular and sympathetic ink, along with his notes on the chemical process. "Tell him it's from his former student, and ask him to keep it safe." Mateo understood immediately. "Insurance?" "Precisely. Leave after Compline, when everyone's asleep. You can reach Madrid by dawn if you ride hard." That evening, Diego found unexpected sanctuary at Isabel's inn. She took one look at his face and led him to her private sitting room behind the main hall, away from curious ears. "You look like a man carrying the world," she said, pouring brandy without asking. "Just a few decades of it," Diego replied, grateful for the warmth of both drink and room. She sat across from him, firelight playing across her features. "The colonel was here earlier. He's growing desperate. Offered me a considerable sum to report on your visits." "What did you tell him?" "That I'm an innkeeper, not a spy." She paused. "Though given what you're uncovering, perhaps everyone was a spy back then." Diego found himself telling her more than he'd intended, about Francisco's confession, the Montemayor family secret, the impossible position of holding truth that could destroy lives. She listened without interrupting, her dark eyes serious. "My husband once had a similar situation," she said finally. "A will that revealed an affair, illegitimate children, everything that would destroy a respectable family. He agonized for weeks about what to do." "What did he decide?" "He died before deciding. The horse that threw him was startled by a snake, they said, though nobody ever found a snake." She met his eyes steadily. "Some secrets defend themselves, Diego."
The warning chilled him more than December wind. Walking back to the monastery, he varied his route, taking narrow paths between buildings, doubling back twice. Perhaps paranoia, perhaps prudence. In his cell, he found his papers disturbed, subtly, but his archival training noticed the slight displacement of documents, the different angle of his notebook. Someone had searched his room. But the Francisco confession was with Mateo, riding through the night toward Madrid.
Diego had only to survive until its safety was assured, then decide how to use this dangerous truth. He barred his door with a chair, something he'd never done before. Outside, wind howled around the monastery's stones, and somewhere in that maze of corridors and centuries, people were making plans about him. Don Carlos, worried about family reputation. Colonel Herrera, desperate for vindication. Father Superior, protective of his institution's honor. Diego lay awake thinking about Brother Francisco, young scribe turned spy, dying with his secret rather than destroying the powerful. Had he been noble or merely weak? And what would Diego himself choose when the moment came? The bells of matins rang at 5:30, as they had for centuries, calling monks to prayer. But Diego heard them differently now, not as summons to God, but as warnings, ancient bronze tongues speaking of dangers that came dressed in holy robes and noble titles. He rose and began preparing his chemicals for another day of revelations, knowing that each discovery brought him closer to a reckoning he couldn't avoid. Through his narrow window he could see the road to Madrid, covered in snow but passable. Somewhere on that road, Mateo carried the truth toward safety. Diego just had to give the boy time, had to continue his performance of the innocent archivist a little longer. The 23rd of December brought unexpected warmth, melting snow from the monastery roofs in a constant drip that sounded like countless clocks marking time. Mateo had returned from Madrid 3 days earlier with confirmation that Professor Martinez had received the package, but also with troubling news. Someone had been asking about Diego at the university, describing him precisely, inquiring about his connections and research. The monastery buzzed with Christmas preparations, providing perfect cover for Diego's investigation. While brothers decorated the church and prepared special foods, he followed a new thread he discovered in Francisco's documents. References to a sanctuary of truth that would outlast both war and peace. It was Brother Tomas, now 40 days sober and sharp-eyed as a hawk, who provided the key insight. Francisco spent unusual time in the old scriptorium, he mentioned while helping Diego test documents. The one damaged by French cannon fire. We stopped using it after the war, but Francisco would go there to meditate, he said. The old scriptorium occupied the monastery's eastern wing, its roof partially collapsed, winter wind whistling through gaps in the stonework. Diego went alone, late in the afternoon when the golden light made even ruins beautiful. The room still held broken furniture, scattered pages from destroyed manuscripts, and the peculiar sadness of abandoned places of learning. But Diego wasn't looking at what was visible. His experience with sympathetic inks had taught him to see what others overlooked. He examined the floor, solid stone blocks that had supported centuries of scholarly weight. Near the eastern wall, scratches on one stone suggested repeated movement. Using an iron bar from the debris, he pried at the edges until the stone shifted, revealing not earth beneath, but a wooden panel. Under the panel lay a metal box, rust-touched but intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was Francisco's true archive. Not just intelligence reports, but correspondence, diary entries, and most remarkably, detailed accounts of the entire network's operations. Here were the real names behind code names, the methods of communication, the careful choreography of resistance. Diego read with growing amazement and horror. The network had been larger than he'd imagined, including not just monks but servants, merchants, even French sympathizers who'd turned against the occupation. And at its heart, a revelation that made him sit back on his heels. Roberto Montemayor hadn't just sold information to the French. He'd actively hunted resistance members, providing names that led to executions. One letter, dated December of 1814, days before Francisco's death, was addressed but never sent. To whoever finds this archive, know that I die unconfessed because my confessor is compromised. Don Carlos's cousin Roberto has threatened to destroy the monastery if I reveal his treason. He has proof that Father Superior knew of our resistance activities and sanctioned them, making the entire monastery complicit in violation of its supposed neutrality. I choose to die silent rather than see this holy place destroyed. But I leave this record so that someday, when the guilty are dead and cannot harm the innocent, truth might emerge. Diego heard footsteps on the damaged stairs and quickly closed the box. Colonel Herrera appeared in the doorway, no longer bothering with pretense. "I followed you," he said simply. "What have you found?" There was something different about the colonel today. A desperation that had hardened into resolution. Diego noticed he kept his right hand in his coat pocket, and the pocket seemed heavy. "Old documents," Diego said carefully. "Francisco's personal papers." "About my grandfather?" Diego made a decision based on instinct and Isabel's warning about secrets that defended themselves. "Your grandfather was innocent. I have proof. He was negotiating prisoner exchanges, not collaborating. The real traitor was Roberto Montemayor." The colonel's face transformed. 55 years of family shame lifting like morning fog. His hand came out of his pocket, empty. "You have proof?" Diego showed him selected documents, the ones clearing Miguel Herrera's name while revealing Roberto's guilt. The colonel read with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "All these years," he whispered, "my father died believing he was the son of a traitor. My mother couldn't show her face in society." He looked up at Diego with something approaching reverence. "How can I repay you?" "Help me get these documents to safety. Don Carlos won't want this revealed." "Don Carlos is dying," Herrera said bluntly. "Cancer, though he hasn't announced it. His nephew Eduardo will inherit, and the boy has no love for his great-uncle's secrets." He paused. "But Father Superior is another matter. The monastery's complicity in the resistance, that could still cause problems." They worked together in the ruins, cataloging Francisco's archive while Christmas preparations continued around them. It was strange, Diego thought, how former adversaries could become allies when truth aligned their interests. Herrera proved surprisingly knowledgeable about church politics and nobility genealogies, filling in context Diego had missed. As evening approached, they heard voices in the courtyard below, Father Superior and Brother Tomas arguing. Diego caught fragments. "Dangerous knowledge. Monastery's reputation. That meddling archivist.
"We need to move quickly," Herrera whispered. "They're deciding what to do about you." They divided the archive. Herrera took documents related to his grandfather and other military matters, while Diego kept Francisco's personal papers and the evidence of Roberto's treachery. They agreed to reconvene at Isabel's inn after midnight mass. But when Diego returned to his cell to prepare, he found Don Carlos waiting, seated in his single chair like a king, granting audience. The old nobleman looked frailer than when he'd first hired Diego, cancer eating him from within, but his eyes remained sharp. "I know what you found," he said without preamble.
Eduardo, my fool of a nephew, told me about your package to the university. Very clever, ensuring copies exist beyond my reach.
Diego said nothing, waiting. "Roberto was my cousin," Don Carlos continued. "His blood money built our family's modern fortune. I've known since I was Eduardo's age. My father told me on his deathbed, made me swear to protect the family name." He coughed, specks of blood on his handkerchief. "But I'm dying, Mendoza. Perhaps it's time for truth. The monastery will survive. It has survived Napoleon, 2 Carlist wars, and the suppression of the Jesuits. A 50-year-old scandal about resistance activities? Father Superior worries too much." Don Carlos stood with difficulty. "Complete your catalog. Include everything. But perhaps wait until after I'm dead to publish? A few months at most." It was a reasonable request from a dying man. Diego nodded agreement. "And Mendoza?" Don Carlos paused at the door. "That young novice, Mateo."
He has potential. When he leaves the monastery, and we both know he will, send him to me. I'll sponsor his university studies. Consider it payment for your discretion about timing.
After the nobleman left, Diego sat in the gathering darkness, pondering the strange mathematics of justice. A family built on blood money would fund the education of a brilliant boy. A colonel would reclaim his family's honor. A monastery would weather another scandal. And Brother Francisco the Raven would finally have his story told. The Christmas bells began ringing, calling all to celebrate the birth of hope into a dark world. Diego prepared for Mass, thinking about the gifts that truth could bring, even when wrapped in decades of lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, at least, some portion of justice had been served. The 4th of January brought the Feast of the Holy Name and a formal gathering in the monastery's great hall. Father Superior had summoned what he called all interested parties to address what he delicately termed the historical discoveries. The room filled with nervous energy, Don Carlos pale but determined, Colonel Herrera in full military dress, Eduardo de Montemayor eager and scholarly, Brother Tomas, hands steady as stone, and Diego standing beside the table where he'd arranged Francisco's documents like evidence in a court of law. Father Superior, despite his 71 years, commanded the room with the authority of someone who'd navigated far worse storms. "We are here," he began, "to determine how best to serve both truth and prudence." Diego had spent the previous night preparing his presentation with the methodical care he'd once applied to cataloging. He began with the chemistry, explaining sympathetic inks in terms even the elderly monks could understand.
Then, chronologically, he revealed Francisco's network, not as treachery, but as patriotism, not as violation of monastic neutrality, but as higher service to Spain and God.
Brother Francisco died believing his silence protected this monastery, Diego said, revealing the final letter. But silence has its own weight. For 50 years, an innocent man's family bore shame while a traitor's family prospered. Don Carlos spoke from his chair, voice weakened but clear. My family's fortune was built on blood. I've known this truth for 30 years, carried it like stones in my chest. Roberto Montemayor sold Spanish lives for French gold, then let Miguel Herrera die for his crimes. He looked directly at Colonel Herrera. I cannot undo the past, but I can acknowledge it. The colonel stood slowly, decades of military bearing holding him rigid. My grandfather died on the 6th of December 1814, shot as a traitor in the courtyard of this very monastery.
His last words, according to the record, were, I forgive those who falsely accused me. For 55 years, my family has lived under that shadow. His voice cracked. To know he died innocent. There are no words. Eduardo, young and passionate, interjected, This must be published. It's history. It's justice. It's dangerous, Father Superior interrupted. The Church's relationship with the secular authorities remains delicate. Evidence of organized resistance from within a monastery was already known, Brother Tomas said unexpectedly. Everyone turned to him. I've been reading the old chronicles carefully. There are references, oblique but clear to anyone who looks. The French knew, the Spanish authorities knew. Everyone knew but pretended not to know, because acknowledging it would have required action nobody wanted to take. Diego felt the room's tension shift, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen river. These men, noble, religious, military, were negotiating not just with history, but with each other, finding ways to let truth emerge without destroying the living. I propose, Diego said carefully, a sealed archive. The documents preserved, catalogued, and stored here at the monastery. Available to scholars with proper authorization, but not published broadly. The chemical process, however, should be shared with the scientific community. It's too valuable to hide. And my grandfather's innocence? Colonel Herrera asked. A separate document, officially recognized by the monastery and the Montemayor family, clearing his name. No need to detail Roberto's crimes extensively. The dead cannot be punished, and the living shouldn't suffer for ancestral sins they didn't commit. Don Carlos nodded slowly. Eduardo will inherit soon enough. Let him decide, when the time comes, how much truth the world needs. He looked at his nephew. But remember, boy, truth without mercy is just another form of cruelty. Father Superior stood, ending the formal discussion. Then we're agreed. Senor Mendoza will complete his catalog with a special restricted section. The Herrera family receives their vindication. The monastery's role remains contextual rather than central, and we all practice the Christian virtue of discretion. After the meeting, Diego found himself walking with Brother Tomas in the cloister, their breath misting in the cold January air. The monk seemed lighter, as if confession had lifted more than just the weight of secrets. 43 days sober, Tomas said quietly. The longest in 5 years. What changed? You did. Watching you pursue truth with such patience, such care for everyone involved. It reminded me why I became a monk.
not to hide from the world, but to help make sense of it. He paused. I've requested to become the monastery's official archivist after you leave.
Father Superior agreed. In the library, Mateo was carefully applying Diego's chemical process to a new set of documents, his technique now expert. The young man had grown in confidence these past months, no longer the uncertain novice, but someone glimpsing his own future. Don Carlos's offer, Mateo said without looking up. University sponsorship. It's real? Very real. Natural philosophy, chemistry, whatever you choose. What I choose, Mateo repeated wonderingly. Such a strange concept after 5 years of obedience. He finally met Diego's eyes. Will you write me a recommendation? I already have. That evening, Diego's last at the monastery before returning to complete his work in Madrid, he dined at Isabel's inn. She'd prepared something special: roasted lamb with herbs, good wine, almond cake. The common room was empty, giving them privacy he suspected she'd arranged. So the great mystery is solved, she said, joining him with her own plate. The phantom parchment explained, the raven identified, justice served in careful measures. You sound disappointed. Not disappointed, thoughtful. She studied him with those intelligent brown eyes. You did something remarkable, Diego. You found a way to reveal truth without destroying anyone still living. That's a rare gift. I had help. You warning me about dangerous secrets, Tomas finding his courage, even Herrera choosing vindication over vengeance. And Don Carlos choosing confession over concealment. She raised her glass. To complicated truths and the people brave enough to face them. They talked until late about everything and nothing. Her plans to expand the inn, his return to Madrid, the way winter light made the monastery look like a painting. When he finally rose to leave, she stopped him with a hand on his arm. I'll be traveling to Madrid next month, business with suppliers. A pause. Perhaps I could call on you. I'd like that, Diego said, surprised by how much he meant it. Walking back to the monastery under stars sharp as truth in the cold night air, Diego reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. He'd come to catalog books and found himself cataloging secrets, sins, and sacrifices. Tomorrow he would return to Madrid, to his empty apartment that might not remain empty much longer. The work would continue. There were still thousands of documents to process, months of careful scholarship ahead. But the heart of the mystery was solved. Brother Francisco could rest, his story told at last. Miguel Herrera's honor was restored. The monastery's secrets were preserved but contained. And Diego himself? He'd learned something about the weight of truth, the way it could crush or liberate depending on how it was wielded. The monastery bells rang Compline, the last prayer of the day. Diego stood in the courtyard where Miguel Herrera had died, falsely accused, where Brother Francisco had chosen silence over revelation, where generations of monks had wrestled with faith and doubt. Soon this would all be memory, recorded in his careful catalog. But tonight it was still alive, still teaching its lessons about courage and compromise, about the past that never quite releases its grip on the present. The 12th of January arrived gray and bitter, with winds that cut through Diego's coat as he made his final exploration of the monastery's archives. He'd been preparing to leave when Mateo discovered something peculiar, a parchment that reacted differently to the chemical treatment, producing not pink letters, but a deep blue script that seemed to pulse in the lamplight.
"I've never seen this reaction before," the young man said, his last week as a novice making him bold with curiosity. "The chemistry is all wrong for cobalt salts." Diego examined the document closely. The base text was a prayer for the dead, dated December 1814, the month of Francisco's death. But the blue script emerging between the Latin lines wasn't intelligence or confession. It was a map, detailed and precise, marking a location within the monastery grounds. Brother Tomas arrived as they were studying it, carrying his morning tea with hands that hadn't trembled in weeks. "That's the old cemetery," he said, recognizing the layout immediately. "The section where they buried monks who died during the French occupation." The three of them went together, an unlikely procession through the January cold. The cemetery lay behind the monastery's eastern wall, its older sections overgrown with winter-brown ivy. Following the map's directions, they found themselves before a modest headstone nearly hidden by brambles. Brother Francisco Alvarez, 1880 to 1814, Servo Dei. But the map indicated something beneath. Using tools borrowed from the groundskeeper, Diego carefully excavated around the stone's base, finding not disturbed earth, but a sealed stone compartment, clearly added after the original burial. Inside, wrapped in what had once been waterproof leather, lay Francisco's final testament. It wasn't paper, but vellum, expensive and meant to last centuries. The text, in Francisco's unmistakable hand, began, "I write this on the eve of my murder, knowing they come tomorrow with poison disguised as medicine." Diego read aloud, while Tomas crossed himself and Mateo stood transfixed. "Let it be known that I die not for the secrets I revealed, but for the one I kept. Roberto Montemayor was more than a traitor. He was a murderer. He killed Prior Sebastian when the old man discovered his treachery, making it appear a natural death.
I have proof hidden where only chemistry can reveal it. But I die before I can act." The document went on to describe how Roberto had systematically eliminated anyone who might expose him, including 2 other monks and a servant girl who'd witnessed his meetings with French officers. Miguel Herrera had been investigating these deaths when Roberto framed him for treason. "My great sin," Francisco concluded, "was not my spying, but my silence about murder. I feared that exposing Roberto would lead to my own death before I could protect the evidence. Now I am dying anyway, poisoned slowly by someone I trusted. I suspect Father Joaquin's predecessor, Prior Anselmo, who owed great debts to the Montemayor family. If you read this, know that I tried to serve both God and Spain, and failed at both through cowardice." The revelation cast new shadows on everything Diego thought he'd understood. Prior Anselmo had died peacefully in his sleep in 1820, 6 years after Francisco. Had he lived those years knowing he'd murdered a fellow monk to protect a family secret? "This changes things," Brother Tomas said unnecessarily. They returned to the library where Diego applied every chemical technique he knew to the vellum. Slowly, incredibly, more text appeared, not in pink or blue, but in a golden brown that seemed to glow. Francisco had used iron gall ink mixed with gold dust, creating a sympathetic ink that required both moisture and heat to reveal itself. This hidden text contained names, dates, and locations of evidence Francisco had compiled against Roberto. Most compelling was a reference to Roberto's personal journal, hidden in the family chapel at the Montemayor estate outside Madrid. Diego faced a dilemma that Francisco had faced 50 years earlier: how to reveal truth about the dead without destroying the living.
Don Carlos was dying, probably had only weeks left. Eduardo would inherit, innocent of his ancestors' crimes.
The monastery had found its peace. Was justice for long-dead victims worth shattering that peace? You could leave it buried, Mateo suggested quietly. Francisco is dead, Roberto is dead, everyone involved is dead. But their families aren't, Diego replied. The Herrera family lived with false shame for 50 years. How many other families suffer because of Roberto's murders? That servant girl had parents, siblings perhaps. Brother Tomas spoke with unexpected wisdom. Truth is like water. It finds its level eventually. The question is whether we guide its flow or let it burst free destructively. That afternoon, Colonel Herrera arrived unexpectedly, accompanied by a woman Diego didn't recognize. Elderly but sharp-eyed, wrapped in expensive furs against the cold. "This is my aunt," the colonel explained. "Miguel Herrera's daughter, my father's sister." When she heard about your discoveries, she insisted on coming. The woman, Doña Carmen, studied Diego with eyes that had seen 8 decades of Spanish history. "My mother died of grief," she said without preamble. 2 years after my father's execution. I was 12 years old. I've waited 70 years to understand why. Diego made another decision, perhaps his most difficult. He showed them Francisco's final testament, watched the old woman's face transform as she read about her father's investigation into the murders, his pursuit of justice that led to his own death. "He died a hero twice over," she whispered, "fighting for Spain and for justice." Colonel Herrera read more practically, his military mind already working through implications. Roberto Montemayor didn't just betray Spain. He was a serial murderer. This needs to be known. "Does it?" Diego asked. "Will it help anyone living?" Don Carlos is dying. Eduardo is innocent. The monastery wants peace. "The servant girl's family deserves to know," Doña Carmen said firmly. "They still live in the village, still bear the whispers that she ran off with a French soldier. Let them have their truth too." Diego thought of Isabel's words about truth serving the living rather than disturbing the dead. Perhaps there was a way to do both. He spent the evening writing a careful document, a historical addendum to his catalog. It cleared not just Miguel Herrera, but all of Roberto's victims, providing evidence of their innocence without dwelling on the gruesome details of Roberto's crimes. It was truth measured in mercy, justice tempered with time. Don Carlos, when presented with this final revelation, surprised everyone by laughing, a bitter sound that turned into coughing blood. "Roberto always was the family monster," he wheezed. "My father hinted at worse crimes but never specified. Yes, Mendoza. Add it to your catalog." Let Eduardo deal with the full truth when he's ready. That night, Diego's last at the monastery, he stood in the cemetery beside Francisco's grave. He'd had Mateo carefully reseal the hidden compartment after making copies of everything. Some secrets, he'd decided, should stay with the dead, even if their essence was revealed. "You can rest now," he told the headstone. "Your truth is known, your courage recognized." The wind carried the sound of Compline bells, calling monks to their final prayers. Tomorrow, Diego would return to Madrid, his catalog complete, his duty discharged. The phantom parchment was phantom no more, its chemical secrets explained, its historical truths revealed. Brother Francisco the Raven
had finally delivered his last message. But standing in that cold cemetery, Diego wondered if any mystery was ever truly solved. Each answer had revealed new questions. Each truth had uncovered deeper complexities.
Perhaps that was the real lesson, that the past never fully releases its secrets, only transforms them into different kinds of questions. The 20th of January dawned clear and cold, with that particular quality of winter light that makes even ordinary things seem precious. Diego stood in his monastery cell one last time, his trunk packed, his tools carefully wrapped, the catalog complete in leather-bound volumes that would outlast everyone who touched this story. Through the narrow window, he could see the Guadarrama Mountains wearing fresh snow like benediction. Brother Tomas arrived to help carry his belongings, 50 days sober now and looking younger for it, as if sobriety had reversed time's flow. "The library won't be the same," he said, then smiled. "Though I suppose that's the point." You've transformed it from a tomb of forgotten books into a living archive. They walked through the monastery one last time, past the restricted vault where the phantom parchment now resided in a climate-controlled case with Diego's scientific explanation attached. No longer feared, but understood, cobalt chloride and iron sulfate, chemistry masquerading as curse. Future visitors would marvel at the ingenuity rather than tremble at superstition. In the great hall, Father Superior waited with an unexpected gathering. Don Carlos, so frail now that Eduardo supported him, but determined to witness this conclusion. Colonel Herrera, with his aunt Doña Carmen, both wearing expressions of profound peace. Mateo, no longer in novice robes, but in the simple clothes of a student, ready for his new life. Even some of the older monks had come, curiosity finally overcoming their suspicion of Diego's chemical mysteries. "Your work here," Father Superior said formally, "has been more than cataloging. You've helped us understand our own history, confront our own shadows. The monastery is grateful." Don Carlos spoke with effort, each word costly. "The Montemayor family acknowledges the truths you've uncovered. Eduardo will ensure they're preserved properly." He looked at his nephew, who nodded solemnly. The young man had aged months in these few weeks, inheriting not just wealth, but the weight of family sins. Colonel Herrera stepped forward, extending a hand that no longer trembled with desperate need for vindication. "My family's honor is restored. My grandfather's grave will finally bear the truth. Falsely accused, died innocent. That's worth more than all the gold in Spain." But it was Mateo who surprised Diego most, approaching with a wrapped package. "For your journey," he said simply. Inside was a manuscript, carefully copied in the young man's excellent hand, Diego's complete notes on sympathetic inks, with additions from Mateo's own experiments. "You've surpassed the teacher," Diego said, genuinely moved. "You taught me to see what others overlook. That's a gift beyond price." The diligence to Madrid was waiting in the courtyard, horses stamping impatiently in the cold. Diego supervised the loading of his trunk, then turned for one last look at El Escorial, Philip's great stone monument to certainty in an uncertain world. But he knew now that even stones could hide secrets. Even certainty could be built on shifting foundations of human choice and chemistry. As he climbed into the coach, he noticed another passenger already seated, Isabel Vargas, dressed for travel, a small trunk at her feet. She smiled at his surprise. "You didn't think I'd let you return to Madrid alone, did you? After all these months of mysteries and revelations?"
your inn is in my manager's capable hands for a few days. I have business in Madrid, remember? Suppliers to see, contracts to negotiate." Her eyes sparkled with humor.
And perhaps an archivist to ensure doesn't disappear into his documents completely. The coach lurched into motion, wheels crunching on frozen ground. As they passed through the monastery gates, Diego saw Brother Tomas and Mateo standing together, mentor and student, though it was unclear now who was which. They waved, and Diego waved back, knowing he'd left the place better than he'd found it, or perhaps simply better understood. The journey to Madrid took 8 hours, but passed quickly with Isabel's company. She had a way of drawing him out, making him reflect on his experiences, not as an archivist, but as a man who'd been changed by what he'd discovered. "You solved more than a chemical mystery," she observed as they stopped to change horses. "You found a way to let truth heal rather than wound." "Francisco solved it 50 years ago," Diego corrected. "I just translated his solution from chemistry into history, and in doing so gave peace to the living and honor to the dead." That's no small thing, Diego Mendoza. Madrid appeared as the sun was setting, its lights beginning to twinkle like ground-level stars. Diego's apartment building looked exactly as he'd left it, but he saw it differently now, not as an empty space haunted by his wife's absence, but as a place waiting to be filled with new purposes. Isabel helped him carry his lighter bags up the stairs, and he was struck by how natural her presence felt in his space. She examined his study with interest, shelves of reference books, chemical equipment, the desk where he'd prepared for the monastery project. "It suits you," she said. "Organized but not rigid, scholarly but practical." She stayed for tea, which became dinner, which became conversation that lasted until the cathedral bells struck midnight. When she finally rose to leave for her hotel, she paused at the door. "My business will take 3 days. Perhaps you could show me the university?" I'm thinking of sponsoring a scholarship in memory of my husband, for students like Mateo, brilliant but without means.
"I'd be honored," Diego said, and meant it. Alone in his apartment, but not feeling alone, Diego unpacked his trunk. The catalog would go to the National Archive tomorrow, copies to the monastery and the Montemayor family. The sympathetic ink formulas would be published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Chemistry. Francisco's story would become a footnote in history books, a curious tale of wartime espionage and chemical innovation. But for Diego, it would always be more. It was the story of how secrets could transform from poison to medicine, depending on how they were administered. It was proof that truth didn't have to destroy to heal, that justice could be served cold but still satisfy. Most of all, it was a reminder that the past never truly dies. It just waits, patient as chemistry, for the right conditions to reveal itself.
He stood at his window, looking out at the Madrid night. Somewhere out there, Mateo was preparing for his new life as a university student. Brother Tomas was maintaining his sobriety one day at a time. Colonel Herrera was finally free of his family's false shame. Don Carlos was facing his end with honesty instead of denial. And Isabel would be back tomorrow, bringing the possibility of a future Diego hadn't imagined when he'd left for the monastery. The phantom parchment had taught him about sympathetic ink, but more importantly, about sympathetic truth, the kind that recognizes human complexity, that balances justice with mercy, that reveals secrets in service of healing rather than harm. Brother Francisco, the Raven, had hidden his messages in invisible ink,
But his greatest message was visible to anyone who looked. That courage could take many forms, including the patience to wait for the right moment for truth to emerge.
Diego prepared for bed, his mind finally quiet after months of mysteries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new documents to examine, new secrets to either reveal or protect. But tonight, he was simply a man who'd finished a job well, who'd served both truth and kindness, who'd learned that sometimes the most profound mysteries were written not in invisible ink, but in the visible struggles of human hearts trying to do right in complicated times. The last thing he did before sleeping was to light a candle for Brother Francisco, the raven who'd waited 50 years to deliver his final message. It had been received, understood, and honored. The phantom parchment was phantom no more, transformed by chemistry and compassion into something more powerful than any curse, a testament to the enduring possibility of justice, even when it comes dressed in the quiet clothes of patient archival work and careful chemical revelation.